The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabby. I am the Training Associate at Waterkeeper Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, Sewage Sleuthing, Using Pollution to Create Community Advocates. Today we have two presenters, Alice Volpita, Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, and Barbara Johnson, Water Quality Scientist at Blue Water, Baltimore. I just want you all to know that we are recording, and I will be uploading this onto the Waterkeeper Alliance resource library and sharing this information after the webinar is over. So if you have to leave early or if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or either of the presenters. So we are going to be taking questions at the end of this webinar. So feel free to put questions in the question box throughout. If you have any clarification questions, I'll be monitoring the question box and letting the presenters know. But if not, we will just take the questions at the end. We're going to start with two quick poll questions. So I will get those up and please take a moment to answer. So the first question, do you know what an MS4 is? Just wait a minute for people to answer. And I'm going to close up the poll now, share the results. So it looks like a good amount of you do, but some people don't. And then we have a second poll question really quick. Do you have an MS4 in your jurisdiction? Just a couple more seconds before we close this one up. Okay. We're going to share these results as well. Okay, and I'm going to hand things over to the two presenters. And just a reminder that if there are any problems with audio or anything, just feel free to put that in the chat box and I'll try to deal with that. And sorry, just got to change the presenter. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabby. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Volpita. I'm the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper here at Blue Water, Baltimore. We have not yet entered the 21st century, so we don't have webcam technology here at the office, but I am the one on the right in this picture, and I'm here with my colleague, Barbara. Barbara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Johnson, and I'm a water quality scientist at Blue Water, Baltimore.
Wonderful. So today we're going to be talking about sewage sleuthing, which I think is fascinating and really exciting. We're also going to be talking about the MS4, which I'll explain what that is for the 35% of you who don't know. For the other 65%, that'll be a little bit of review, but I think it'll still be really valuable. So really, the title of this presentation is Sewage Sleuthing, but we could have just as easily called it something like How to Trick People into Caring About Stormwater, because that's really what this is all about. It's about taking an idea that is kind of exciting, and believe me, by the end of this, you too will think sewage is exciting, and using that to pivot and really focus people's attention on the issues that matter to you and turning those people into advocates. So today we're going to go through a couple of different points. So first of all, who is Blue Water Baltimore? That's the organization that Barbara and I both work with here in Baltimore. Second, we're going to go through what MS4 pollutants we're really concerned about. So this training or this webinar is meant as it's kind of half informational for people who don't have an MS4 and are interested in learning more about it, but it's also half train the trainer session. So I'll be going through this as if it were one of our normal Pollution 101 trainings that we typically give to volunteers. And so sometimes, and then I'll break away from that format a few times, just kind of, I don't know, bring down the fourth wall and acknowledge that this is a presentation for people who may be giving a presentation like this. So we'll talk a little bit about MS4 pollutants in that way. And then I'm going to talk about how to explain the MS4 so that people will actually listen. I worked in the water quality monitoring field for about 5 years before I came to Blue Water Baltimore as a water quality scientist, and then later as the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper. And I had no idea that the MS4 existed. I didn't know anything about it. I grew up in a relatively rural area, but a lot of jurisdictions have MS4s. They're really important, and almost nobody knows about them. Just regular people walking on the street, nobody's taught about these things. So it's really important that people understand what the MS4, the stormwater system, is, but it can be a little wonky. So when you're talking about underground pipe infrastructure, it can get a little sticky. So I'm going to share some tips that we've found have been helpful in the past for communicating effectively about the MS4. Next, we'll be talking about our Outfall Screening Blitz project, which is really cool. It's our illicit discharge detection and elimination surveys that we conduct with volunteers. And this is really how you get people looped into the sewage sleuthing club. And then finally, pollution reporting and advocacy, which a lot of you are already familiar with these topics generally, but really talking about how to pivot from knowledge about the MS4 into going out on these field excursions to find sewage to reporting all different types of pollution. So I know that this is a global webinar. Waterkeeper Alliance is a global organization, so I wanted to orient everybody here to where we are and who we are. Blue Water Baltimore is a nonprofit organization located in the United States. We're on the East Coast in Maryland. And more specifically, we work within the watersheds surrounding the Baltimore Harbor. So this is a quick snapshot. It's a screenshot from our website where we post all of our most recent water quality monitoring readings. We take a whole suite of health parameters at 49 different monitoring stations, tidal and non-tidal stations. The website is baltimorewaterwatch.org, or you can also get there if you go to the expertly named howsthewaterhun.org. So this is just a snapshot of all of the different monitoring stations that we have, and it shows you the different watersheds that we work in around the Patapsco River and around the Baltimore Harbor. And this is a little infographic about how Blue Water Baltimore works. So a lot of your organizations are probably very similar to Blue Water Baltimore. Blue Water is, I would say it's a mid-sized nonprofit. I don't think that we can claim small status anymore. But we're a local watershed group. We formed in 2010 as a merger of 5 local watershed organizations with the understanding and with funder support that we could get more done together than as disparate entities across the landscape. So one of those original 5 merger organizations was the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, and now Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper is part of Blue Water Baltimore. So just like many of your organizations, we identify the top pollutants negatively affecting our waterways. That would be sewage, trash, stormwater runoff, and toxic pollutants. I know the top pollutants are different for every single waterkeeper, but in Baltimore, these are really the big 4 that we deal with. And then Blue Water Baltimore provides some of the solutions to those problems. So we do things like stream cleanups, we do storm drain stenciling to educate people about the MS4 and what should and shouldn't go down the drain. Hint, it is nothing except for rain. And then we also help people plant rain gardens. We do a lot of tree plantings. We have a native plant nursery that we run. And then where the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper comes in is really in the advocacy, legislation, legal enforcement, and water quality monitoring. This is an aerial view of Baltimore City. So this goes back to that earlier map I just showed you. This is still Baltimore City. And the reason why I'm showing you this aerial view is really just so that you can see the difference between the green and the gray. So this is a really good depiction of how much impervious surface we have in Baltimore City. We have over 45% impervious coverage in our city, which is extremely high, and it produces a lot of polluted stormwater runoff. And so that's really the reason why we have polluted stormwater runoff, is because of all of our impervious surfaces that are draining directly into our MS4, which is the municipal separate storm sewer system. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we keep going. So one of the questions, this gets into the territory of, I know you guys probably know a lot about this already, but these are the slides we use to explain these types of things to volunteers. So please feel free after this webinar to poach any of these slides, to work with them. If you hear something that rings true to you and you think, oh yeah, that's actually a good way of explaining that I never thought of before, then please use all of these tips. So when we're talking about impervious surface and we're talking about polluted stormwater runoff, there's really two big pieces to that we care about. And it's about the quantity of stormwater entering our waterways, and it's about the quality of stormwater entering our waterways. So in terms of quantity, the more impervious surface we have, that creates like a high-speed highway for rain droplets to enter our streams. Whereas rain might be slowed down and cleaned up if it were allowed to drain down into soil naturally and enter our watersheds the way that it was supposed to be. When we have too much impervious surface, all of that stormwater gushes into the nearest curb drain. It goes into the stormwater system, which isn't treated in any way, and it gets directed right into our streams. So in Baltimore City, one of the biggest degradations to our streams is really to the habitat for the streams. We have a hard time getting anything, getting macroinvertebrate colonies to really establish, or to have fish colonies really establish, because every time there's a major storm event, the waterways are so flashy that the water just gushes through those streams and it cuts away at the stream bank, and it makes it so that nothing can live there. So in terms of stormwater runoff, we're really worried about quantity, and then also all of the pollutants that are carried into our waterways from a major storm event. So there's way more stormwater entering our waterways than there used to be with all of this increased impervious surface. Not just the polluted stormwater, but also just the fact that global climate change is causing more rain events in the mid-Atlantic region. So we're one of those lucky states that gets more rain as global climate change continues to affect the entire world. When we're talking about pollutants that are dragged into our waterways through polluted stormwater, we're talking about things like fecal bacteria, and in and of themselves can be dangerous, but also are a major indicator that there's other things going on. So fecal bacteria is an indicator that there's pathogens that can harm human health and, pets. Fecal bacteria can also be an indication that people aren't picking up their pet waste. Also, we have some rural areas where fecal bacteria is linked to deer populations. We have some pretty out of control deer populations in some of our suburban areas, and sometimes that can be the source of the fecal bacteria as well. Polluted stormwater runoff is also bringing heavy metals into our waterways. It's bringing legacy toxins into our waterways. Sediment from improperly stabilized construction sites, nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, and those come from sewage, which sewage overflows and stormwater are inextricably linked, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But also from homeowners who are applying fertilizer to their own lawns. It's from fossil fuels. It's from sewage treatment plants that can experience sewage overflows and heavy rain events. And then finally, in Baltimore, this is a big one, and I'm sure it's a big one for most of you, trash. So our stormwater conduit system is bringing all of these pollutants directly into our waterways without ever being treated, and that's the big deal when we're talking about polluted stormwater runoff. So we've talked a little bit about why stormwater matters, how it's getting into our waterways. But now it's time to explain to your volunteers and to your attendees what the MS4 is. And this is the tricky part, because when I first started with Blue Water Baltimore, I started giving these Pollution 101 trainings, and I saw the eyes glaze over. Because when you start talking about underground pipe systems, and you're talking to people who have never heard these terms in their entire lives, it can be tough for people, it can be tough for it to click. And it requires some kind of paradigm shift, I think. And like I said, it took me a really long time when I started working with Blue Water Baltimore, and when I entered kind of the nonprofit sector. Previously, I was with government. It took me a long time to really understand what the stormwater system is, which now to me sounds crazy because it's relatively simple. But at the time, it just wasn't clicking. And it's almost like that meme from the internet from a few years ago, the gold or the blue dress. And it's like, you can't see the other color that everybody's telling you it is until you do. And then as soon as you see, oh yeah, it was a gold dress the whole time, then you understand the stormwater system, you can talk about it, it makes sense, and you think to yourself, how could I ever have not understood what it is? Anyway, all of that is to say it's confusing, so it's important to know how to talk about it. So when we talk about our stormwater system, we talk about the Baltimore fire of 1904. So I would suggest looking into the history of your stormwater system. Let's back up really quick, just so that everybody's on the same page. An MS4 is a municipal separated stormwater sewer system. So what that means is municipal means it's operated by a government entity. Separated means that it's separated from the sanitary sewer system. Stormwater means that the only thing that should be conveyed through this system is rainwater. Sewer is just a network of pipes. So sometimes people think, they hear sewer and they think sewage, but I always tell people that, you know, the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles, they lived in the sewers, but they lived in the stormwater system, not the sanitary sewer system. So sewer just means a network of pipes. And then system is just the whole system altogether. So municipal separated stormwater sewer system. So like I was saying, in Baltimore, our MS4 is a result of the 1904 fire. So I would really highly suggest looking into the history of your MS4 and see if there's any interesting stories. I think that as a human species, we react really well to narrative storytelling. So if you can add a storytelling element to speaking to your volunteers about the MS4, I think that's really helpful. So Barbara, would you be willing to give like a very short rundown of the Baltimore fire and why it resulted in the MS4?
Sure, yes. Before the fire, we didn't have much of a system. Toilets were mandated, but that's about it. Everyone still had to get rid of their own sewage. After the fire, it was pretty cutting edge actually to build this system that was not combined. It was two separate pipes. So it took a while to do. It took about 3 years to complete, but that is the short and sweet of our system.
Excellent, yeah. So in 1904, there was a massive fire in Baltimore City, and as a legacy of that fire, actually now all fire hydrant couplings are uniform across the country. So when fire companies were responding to this major disaster in Baltimore, we had companies responding from DC, from Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, and they all got here and they came here and they just had to stand around with their firefighting equipment because their hoses couldn't connect to the hydrants. So that is like one of the big legacies of the 1904 fire. But the other is that once the city basically burned to the ground in the downtown area, we took that as an opportunity to build out our separated system. So as Barbara said, she's exactly right. Previous to the 1904 fire, we were in the same boat as everybody else. We had a combined sewer system. We were experiencing sewage overflows every time it rained. And then we got this fancy new separated system. And all of a sudden, Baltimore was hot stuff because we didn't have sewage flowing in our streets. And then we didn't maintain our pipes. So fast forward 100 years later, more than 100 years later, and once again, we have sewage overflowing into our streets. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that happens, the dynamic of a sewage overflow, in the next slide. So the next thing that I suggest doing when you're talking about the MS4 is reviewing each pipe in detail. The MS4 is the stormwater system, but it's also really important to talk about the sanitary sewer system and the drinking water system. I don't think there's any more, I don't think any other city would have any other pipes, unless there's a secret fourth pipe that your city has that you want to talk about. So we talk about how the MS4 is supposed to work and then what goes wrong. And this is where things start getting fun because then we seamlessly segue into sewage hunting. So this is a really great graphic that we use to describe the MS4 and how it's supposed to work, and then some of its problems. So you guys are all more than welcome to use these images. They have the Creative Commons logo down on the bottom of them. We'd prefer to keep the Blue Water logo on there as well, just so that people know where they originated from. But we want these to be used far and wide. So we're gonna send all of these graphic images to Gabby so that she can put them online on the digital library shelf so that everybody can access them and use them if you find this helpful. So in Baltimore City, we have a 3-pipe system. The first pipe is the drinking water supply, and the drinking water supply is pressurized. So that's the reason why in the city, you have water pressure. When you go into a shower or you turn on the faucet, there's water pressure. The nice, in more rural areas, like, so I grew up with a well. And what that means is that when the power went out in my house, when I was a little kid, you couldn't flush the toilet anymore. Well, you could flush the toilet one time, but that was it. You had one shot and then you were done, because the well pump was also out of power. So the toilet wouldn't refill. So we had to do things like filling up the bathtub when we thought the power would go out, because we didn't have pressurized water system all the time. In Baltimore, we have pressurized water all the time. So when the power goes out, you still have water pressure, which is really great news. It blew my mind the first time that I could, flush the toilet when the power went out. The nice thing about having a pressurized system is that when there is a water main break, and there are water main breaks a lot in Baltimore, most of the pollution tends to get pushed away from the pipe. So even when there's a water main break, typically it doesn't pollute the drinking water supply. So we have the pressurized water system, and that's kind of separated. It's all on its own, hanging out, doing its own thing. It's in pretty good shape. And then we have the stormwater system, the MS4, which in this picture is depicted by this kind of yellow pipe. This is the stormwater system. And then we have the sanitary sewer system, which is this red pipe. So I'll go over the sanitary sewer system first, because that's what I think people are most familiar with. The sanitary sewer system does exactly what it sounds like. It brings sewage from your house or your place of business, and it takes it to a wastewater treatment facility. So every time you flush the toilet, every time you pour a bowl of Fruit Loops down the sink, anytime you take a shower and all that soap just goes away, it's all getting collected into the sanitary sewer system, which is this red pipe system. It flows downhill, so it's gravity driven. There's no pumping involved, except for at pumping stations to get it up over hills. But in general, you can think of the sanitary sewer system as being gravity driven, and all of that sewage just slowly falls downhill, and it eventually goes to a wastewater treatment plant. In Baltimore, we have 2 big wastewater treatment plants, and they're both right at the edge of a major waterway. So we have one in the Patapsco River, we have one in the Back River. And the reason why wastewater treatment plants are positioned right at the edge of a major waterway is because that is the lowest point in a landscape, is right next to the water. And all of the treated sewage then just gets discharged back out into the river. Pretty wild, pretty awesome, modern marvel. Okay. So when the sanitary sewer system is working as designed, you never even know it's there. When all of these pipes are working as designed, you never even know that they're there. The stormwater system, the MS4, the Municipal Separated Stormwater Sewer System, is this yellow pipe that's right next to the sanitary sewer system. So the stormwater system starts with curb drains. So in your street, you have drains. All of the rainwater flows down the street. It goes down the drain so that we don't get flooding in our roads. And all of that water gets collected into the stormwater system, and then it gets conveyed. It goes directly out into a stormwater outfall, which is the end of the pipe right here. You can see liquid flowing out of the end of the pipe. And that water goes directly into the nearest body of water. So the nearest stream, the nearest harbor, the nearest piped underground stream system. So this water is never treated. It goes straight from your street into your stream. So in Baltimore, we say, our streets are our streams. Oh, isn't that catchy? You can use that too. So in theory, having a separated stormwater system makes it so that we're not wasting our time and resources treating rainwater when we really don't need to. In practice, what's happening is that this system is acting as a conveyance for pollution because it's not treated at all. We don't have any kind of catchment system at the end of our outfalls here in Baltimore. So anytime there's trash being swept into a storm drain, it goes directly into the receiving waterway. Now, the problem with these 2 pipes, if they're truly separated, there shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's a modern engineering marvel because you're keeping rainwater out of the sanitary sewer system, so that system isn't getting inundated every single time we have a major rain event. But in practice, both of these pipes are very old, and they're both driven by gravity. So unlike the drinking water supply, which is pressure driven, both the sanitary sewer system and the stormwater system are gravity driven. And that means that they are constantly fighting to occupy the same space in a given landscape, which is the lowest possible point. Because these pipes, remember, they cannot flow uphill without a costly pumping station being installed. So engineers want to lay these pipes continuously flowing downhill. And because there's only one lowest point in any landscape, they're right next to each other. And that would be fine and well if we didn't have a system from 1904 that hasn't been properly updated and maintained for over 100 years. These pipes are made from anything from concrete to clay pipe. We've seen some PVC, cast iron, even things like polished up wood. Those are the things that our old sewer systems are made out of. The general useful life of a segment of pipe is quoted to be anywhere between 75 and 100 years old. Unfortunately, we have over 4,000 miles of combined pipe under Baltimore City, and the city is currently not replacing the pipe system at nearly the rate necessary to reach that 75 to 100-year lifespan. So we have crumbling pipes. And the problem with having these crumbling pipes right next to each other is that during dry weather, sanitary sewage, well, it's not so sanitary, liquid feces are spewing out of the sanitary sewer system and leaking into the storm drain system. And then once any liquid gets into the storm drain system, the pipe works as designed and it sends it directly into the nearest stream. So that's a dry weather discharge of sewage. And it also works in the opposite direction when we have a rain event. When we get a rain event and this stormwater pipe is full of water, all of that hydrostatic pressure, there's so much rainwater inside that pipe, it starts spewing out of the pipe underground and it seeps into the closest exit point, which is a crack in the sanitary sewer system. So in rain events, we have mixing of these two pipes in the opposite direction. So rainwater is infiltrating the sanitary sewer system. And when that happens, we get major sewage overflows out of our streets and back into people's homes because these pipes are not designed to carry that much sewage. So I'm going to review the specific dynamics of a sewage overflow in a couple of slides, but this is a really excellent slide to give your volunteers the basics of the MS4, the sanitary sewer system, and the drinking water supply if you have a pressurized system. So we use this next slide as a follow-up to the previous one that kind of builds on top of the previous slide. You can see it still has that cross-section of the pipes. And we always use this one to talk to people about the different pollutants that can enter the stormwater system. So, you know, I'm not going to go through this with all of you. You're all smart people. You're waterkeepers, for God's sake. But you can see things like non-compliant construction sites, people washing their cars, people not picking up their dog poop, trash in the streets, you know, connected storm drain systems. I think something with illegal dumping over here, all kinds of bad stuff. And again, this is just an example of some of the documents that we have to share so that if you feel that this might be useful for your communities, you can use something like this. So this is a really nice depiction of the dynamic of a sewage overflow that I was talking about earlier. I know it looks crazy and overwhelming when you first look at it, but really what this is all about is how stormwater moves across the landscape, how it's infiltrating our sanitary sewer system, and then what happens to that mixture of sewage and rainwater in a pipe that really isn't designed to carry that much liquid. And what happens is that the sanitary sewer pipe mixed with stormwater starts to back up through the pipe, and you get an explosion of sewage either out of a manhole in the middle of the street, out of one of these sanitary sewer stacks that are lined up in the stream. So these stacks are meant to vent sewer gases, but also if you have a major rain event, sewage will explode out of the top of them. Or sewage will just exit out of these manholes, and then they'll flow down the street, enter the storm drain system as it was meant to do, and ultimately everything gets discharged into your waterway. So sewage overflows are a dynamic problem. There's a lot of different layers going on, but it's really important and it's degrading our waterways. When we're talking about sewage in our waterways, first of all, yeah, sure, it's gross. Like, that's obvious. But, you know, it's more than just it's gross. Number one, people can get really sick from coming into contact with raw sewage. So, people can contract pathogens. I know that we're all extremely aware of public health issues right now. And sewage overflows, unfortunately, and contact with sewage is a vector of transmission for all sorts of things, including what we're dealing with right now. But also from an ecological perspective, nutrient pollution is incredibly harmful to our waterways. So again, this is a topic that I feel that most of you listening right now are probably pretty familiar with, but this is a really nice slide that it explains eutrophication in a way that hopefully is a little bit more understandable by your volunteers. So what I always say is that when we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus. And then I always say, I'm going to tell my stupid joke. I always say, when you go to a nursery, like if you go to Lowe's or you go to Home Depot and you're in the garden section and you get a bag of fertilizer, what 3 letters are on that bag? And people always say, nitrogen, like what 3 letters? And they say NPK. And I always say, that's right, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then I laugh and nobody else laughs, and it's probably happening right now, but I can't hear any of you. So anyway, when we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus because those are limiting nutrients, which means that, there's lots of different nutrients. But if you add nitrogen or if you add phosphorus to an ecosystem, those are the nutrients that plants really need in order to grow. Those are the ones that are limiting. There's already tons of calcium. There's already tons of, all sorts of other nutrients. I can't think of any right now. But nitrogen and phosphorus are where it's at. And those are also the nutrients that are carried in untreated sewage, also treated sewage, and polluted stormwater runoff. So imagine a sewage overflow as basically dumping millions of bags of fertilizer into your nearest water body. And the reason why that's important is because there are naturally occurring phytoplankton, little water plants in your body of water, if you have a tidal water system, or even non-tidal. Yeah, even non-tidal. Sorry, I mostly think about harbor algae blooms. So anyway, there's these little water plants that naturally occur. They're good for the ecosystem. It's what the fish eat. But when you dump a bag of fertilizer on top of them, those plants are going to do what any other plant does. They'll grow out of control. And that's when you get an algae bloom. So in the bottom left-hand corner here, this is a picture of a mahogany tide algae bloom in the Baltimore Harbor. And I mentioned earlier that we do water quality sampling in our local waterways, and we've been doing that since 2009. And one of the really interesting things we've found over the years is that the Baltimore Harbor, the inner harbor in particular, is subject to an almost constant algae bloom. And that's because we have an almost constant stream of sewage, aka fertilizer, feeding the algae in that area. So the typical life cycle of an algae bloom is that it blooms and then it starts to die off, and then a little while later it blooms and then it starts to die off. In the harbor, our algae blooms are not dying off. But in a more normal situation, what happens is that this algae bloom eventually starts to die off, because eventually it'll eat up all of the food. There's no more resources for it to live. And once it does start to die off, bacteria begin decomposing that dead algae. And those bacteria are what are sucking out all of the oxygen from your body of water. So once there's no oxygen in the water, that's what causes a fish kill. Algae can also be toxic all on its own to fish and to humans, but typically when you see a fish kill as the result of an algae bloom, as the result of a sewage overflow, this is the path that it's following. So again, the reason why I'm sharing this with you, I think a lot of you know about these issues already. Maybe this is news to some of you, which is awesome, but this is another slide or a template of a slide that you can use to talk about eutrophication, which is kind of a wonky subject, with your volunteers. And now that you've got their attention about sewage and dogs pooping in the water, you can kind of pivot a little bit at this point, and you can teach them how to identify all types of different types of pollution. So this presentation doesn't have like our full gallery of sewage overflows and poor construction sites and all kinds of like gnarly illicit discharges. But this would be the place to really, like, you've got their attention. Now it's time to rope them in and teach them, give them the tools they need to properly identify pollution. So many times we get people coming to us and they say, like I saw something going on. I'm not really sure what I saw, but it didn't seem like it was right. And, 9 times out of 10, their gut intuition is absolutely spot on, and they were right, and somebody's polluting, and it's something that we can take action against or compel somebody else to take action against. So this is really the time to arm your volunteers with the knowledge and tools they need for how to properly identify and then also report pollution. So now we're going to shift into the Outfall Screening Blitz project. And what we tell our, that's Barbara, by the way, what we tell our volunteers is that if they've gone through this Pollution 101 training, which is basically what you guys all just sat through, they'll be eligible to come out into the field with us and hunt for sewage, which, to a certain type of person may sound horrible and disgusting, but to most people, that's like awesome. So this is a project that we do with small groups of volunteers. It's usually just between 2 and 4 people. We identify a specific stream reach where we're going to walk in the stream, and we comprehensively map and screen all of the outfalls we encounter on that walk. So typically we try to keep these stream stretches between 1/2 and 3/4 of a mile long in order to, not fatigue our volunteers, because it's actually really hard work. We tell our volunteers that we're hunting for illicit discharges, and this is really what this type of program is called in a lot of MS4 jurisdictions. A lot of they're required to have a program like this, but doing it with volunteers is supplemental. And we've actually been able to build a really good relationship with our municipalities based on our ability to go out and add capacity to a project that the city and the county are already required to do. So the idea is that we go into a stream, we put on waders, and we walk until we find a stormwater outfall. And we only do these events after 48 hours of dry time, which means there can't have been any kind of rain event within the previous 48 hours. And that's to eliminate stormwater as a potential discharge. We don't really care if the stormwater system is conveying stormwater, because that's what it's supposed to do. But if we come across a stormwater outfall and it's discharging liquid, and it's been more than 48 hours since we had any rain, then you know that it's either groundwater or firefighting liquid, like firefighting water, or it's an illicit discharge. And these illicit discharges can be anything from sewage to wash water from, bad laundromats or car washes. They can be industrial or commercial in nature. They can be from a water main break, and that's an illicit discharge that the city or the county needs to be notified about. They can be sediment from non-compliant construction sites. It can be all sorts of things. So this is what we're looking for with our volunteers when we walk through the streams. So again, we take a look at all of our waterways, and we select a stream stretch that's between 1/2 and 3/4 of a mile long. And, depending on whether you're writing a grant to get funding for this type of work, and you want to stay in a targeted area, or if you just have been getting a lot of pollution reports from a specific area, either one of those is perfectly valid as a reason to identify a specific area and then seek out that spot and do an outfall screening blitz. We always remind people that they really are going to get in the water, and it is a very physical activity. We invariably get people who didn't actually understand that they were going to be walking in the water that day. We provide waders for them and all of the sampling gear, but it's really important to let people know that this is a physical activity. So as I said, we catalog every single outfall we come across, whether it's dry or discharging. We have nice data sheets that we use to record all of our information, so that if we do find an illicit discharge, we can properly record it and we can refer it to the responding agency. So in our case, Baltimore City Department of Public Works, so that they can actually do something to fix it. We collect a sample from the outfall, either by hand if it's a small enough discharge, or we use an extremely fancy sampling apparatus if it's a larger discharge. And if you can't tell, this is a Nalgene bottle duct taped to a stick. So once we collect our sample, then we determine the flow rate that's coming out of the stormwater outfall. And the reason why we do that is so that we can get some idea of not just, okay, this is sewage, but this is how much sewage is coming out. And that's just when we've been out here witnessing it. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. if you can capture the entirety of your sample in a sampling vessel of known volume, you can just time how long it takes to fill that bottle up. You can also use a ping pong ball and a ruler to try to, or a measuring tape to take measurements of depth, width, and height of your discharge, and then time how long it takes a ping pong ball to flow out of a culvert. That's a little bit less scientific, but it works pretty well if you have a heavy discharge flow. We take all of our samples back to our lab, which is just our office building. This is actually our old office building, but this is a picture of all of our volunteers wearing personal protective equipment, and they are running their samples. And so they take a little aliquots, little portions of the samples that we have collected, and they run a whole suite of tabletop tests on them for these different parameters. So we are looking for things like ammonia, which is a good indicator of sewage. We're looking for potassium, which is a good indicator of industrial discharge. We're looking for surfactants, which is a good indicator for wash water. Optical brighteners is also a really good one for both sewage and optical brightener and wash water, because optical brighteners is that molecule in like Tide detergent that makes your brights brighter, and it doesn't exist in a natural ecosystem. So if you find any of those, then that's a good indication of wash water or sewage. We look for fluoride because that's a good indication of drinking water or a water main break. And then we're also measuring for turbidity because that's a good indication of poor dewatering practices at construction sites. This is just a picture of all of those different tabletop handheld instruments that we have our volunteers use. None of these are extremely expensive. I can look up and see, what the budget for these individual items are, but you can also look for things like this. And I think, honestly, I think we got our reagents for ammonia like through Amazon. So it's not, some of these things you have to go through like Fisher Scientific or, whatever, Hannah or some other website like that. But some of them you can get just through Amazon. And then this is the really important piece to keep people engaged over the long term. This is the feedback loop. So we're almost there. We're almost at the end. When Blue Water Baltimore goes out and we get volunteers to come out on an event with us. We're here. When Blue Water Baltimore goes out and we get volunteers, we get them to come out on an event with us, an Outfall Screening Blitz event, and they collect a water sample, they analyze it, and they find sewage. That's really exciting for them, but it kind of leaves them hanging. So the next step is that Blue Water Baltimore takes the results of those tests. We let the municipality in charge of the MS4 know what we found. And then because we've been able to build a strong relationship with the city, they come back to us and they update us. They say, no, we weren't able to duplicate those findings, which happens a lot. And that can potentially be an episodic event. So it's just like a one-time thing and never happen again, or it can be intermittent in nature. Or they'll tell you, yeah, we found something and now we're fixing the problem. We're sending a maintenance crew out there to fix the leaky sewer pipe that we were able to find through CCTV of the line. And then we take that information and we go back to the entire group of people who is interested in doing pollution 101s or who has come out on an Outfall Screening Blitz with us, and we let them know the results of that investigation. So this is just an amazing feedback loop. It's an amazing story of volunteers on the ground measurably reducing pollution to our local waterways. And we can take those stories and we can do social media around them. We can do newsletter blasts around them. We can do appeals about them. We talk to funders about these types of stories. It's a really, really valuable program. And not only that, but once you have that feedback loop and once people feel engaged and they feel like the pollution reporting that they're doing is actually being listened to and is resulting in a measurable outcome, then they become advocates for you. And at that point, you can really get them to do anything you want. No, just kidding. You can get them to advocate for specific pieces of legislation. They can testify about budget hearings. You can do small things like let them know they need to pick up their pet waste or don't pour fats, oils, and grease down the drain. Small things like that. But really, this is one of those bottom rungs to the stewardship ladder that we're all looking for, that is relatively low cost. And all it requires is hosting a pollution 101 training like this and then staying engaged and showing up and responding to people. Okay, I think that's it. That's everything. So I guess we'll open it up to questions. I don't know how much time we have. We have just a few minutes, but yeah, I would love to entertain any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We have somebody laughed at your joke, so just so you know.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll give people a little bit of time to write their questions in, but we have one right here. Okay, so we have a question from Melissa. In Boulder, Colorado, we get a lot of white foamy stuff on our roads after rain. The city does not seem concerned about this. Do you have any idea what this is from and what we should do? It flows into the storm drain systems in large volumes, especially in the spring.
So I don't know what that is. I know that around here, when it first starts raining, you know, the roads are extremely slick, and that's because that first flush of rain is picking up all the dirt and oil off of the road. So it could be something like that. But my suggestion might be to take a sample. Excuse me. So you could potentially take a stormwater sample, like during a first flush situation, so that it's not too diluted, and then run it for maybe like oils and grease, or I'm not really sure what else you might run it for. I'm not sure, but it does sound like an illicit discharge, because the only thing that's allowed to be in the MS4 is rainwater or firefighting liquid, unless you have a permitted NIPD's permit, which it doesn't sound like this is.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. When collecting and then analyzing, do you have standards to measure against, for example, baselines? And are you calibrating the equipment so they all generate the same quality values?
Yes, this is a great question. So we use guidance from the Center for Watershed Protection. So there is a manual, an IDDE, an Illicit Discharge Detection and Elimination Manual, promulgated or set forth by the Center for Watershed Protection. And it's a long read, but it's great. And they give very specific thresholds for the different constituents that you might be looking for that tell you what you might be seeing. So for example, for ammonia, it's 0.3 milligrams per liter. And if you have a sample that pops above that, there's a good likelihood that what you're seeing is sewage, unless there's some kind of interference with something else. And if it's below that, it means you move down the kind of the triage list to the next thing that it could be, like fluoride for drinking water, for example. And we do calibrate our instrumentation in-house. So we have calibration solution that we use. And again, all of that type of thing is available from the product manufacturer, the instrumentation manufacturer, for all of these instruments.
Okay. Another question. Do you advocate for stormwater treatment?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So stormwater treatment comes in a lot of different forms. What I ideally want to see, so in Baltimore, we have this little guy hanging out at one of our major outlets into the harbor, and his name is Mr. Trash Wheel. And Mr. Trash Wheel is this anthropomorphic trash collecting mouth, I guess. And his job is to basically eat all of the trash that comes down the canal before it can enter into the harbor. And, you know, we have a really good relationship with the organization who's in charge of Mr. Trash Wheel. And I say, with all the love and jest in my heart, I want to starve Mr. Trash Wheel to death, because really, ultimately, it's about upstream solutions. So what I want to see is a situation where we don't need to treat our stormwater in situ.
All right. We have a bunch of questions here, so I'm just going to read through them. And I don't know if you can answer this, but what would you estimate your annual water quality budget is?
So that's a good question. I would say just for our ambient monitoring, so not including this IDDE project that I just told you about, it's roughly $200,000 a year, which I'm sure a lot of you just, you know, your eyes got big or passed out or something. But that's about how much it is for us every year. It's really extensive, and we do very rigorous monitoring. We send all of our samples away to an accredited laboratory for analysis, and we grind every year to fund that program. So in some years, we haven't been able to fully implement the program, but that's about how much it costs.
Okay. This might be something that you can email to me that I can then share. Can you provide an equipment list for your program?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share that with you.
Great. I will send that. Just to let everyone know, I'm hoping to either send this later today or tomorrow morning, everything. Okay, we have another question. Hi, I'm Kenneth from Nicoya Peninsula Waterkeeper in Costa Rica. If possible, can you share the guide to compare the parameters that you were talking about in some of your results? I think that's another email thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Let's see, we have a few more minutes. Are there outlier manufacturers whose equipment or testing methods you would discourage the use of, such as test strips?
So I've never had like a particularly bad experience with any instrumentation. I've had particularly good experiences with Lamont, and no, I don't work for Lamont. But the nice thing about their Smart 3 meters, they're pricey, but they are multivariate. Or they have multiple different channels on them. So you can sample for copper and ammonia and a whole suite of other things in the same machine if you have all of those different reagents. So all you have to do is buy the different reagents, and one handheld product can give you a lot of power. I'll also say we use, it's called an Aquafloor, I think, and that's the one that reads both turbidity and optical brighteners. So it's a dual channel instrument, and anything that's like dual channel like that, I'm a big fan of, because ultimately it's cheaper, and it makes it easier to carry in the field if you need to carry it in the field. It's more efficient.
Great. All right, another question. You ever find out the municipality is not in compliance with their permit? What do you do in this situation?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. I think that's a bigger question.
All right. And then I'll move on to the next question. Okay. In what circumstances do you report sample values using accredited laboratories, and when is it appropriate to submit results gathered by volunteers?
So we use all of our monitoring data that we collect for regulatory purposes every year. So every year, the Maryland Department of the Environment solicits information for its 303D impairment listings, and we submit our data for that reason. We also submit our data to the Chesapeake Bay program for development of the Chesapeake Bay model. In terms of like litigation or enforcement issues, there have been times when we collected like one-off samples of specific discharges from facilities. And as long as we're following standard operating procedures that we have documented in-house, like in our quality assurance project plans, so basically we can follow the same sampling procedures for a one-off sample that we typically implement for like our non-tidal sampling, for example, just a little bit modified. So as long as we're, wearing gloves and taking all of the appropriate measures, and we have all the chain of custody sheets, and it's being analyzed by an accredited laboratory, then in theory, those samples or the results should be able to be used in court. I don't believe that we have ever submitted results of our sampling for litigation in the past, but I could be wrong.
Okay, we have another question here from Warren. What are the frequencies of testing, likely based on specific seasons or weather events or continuous levels?
So for the Outfall Screening Blitz project, this is really like a one-time, let's go out there and see what we find. And in Baltimore, we typically find something. There have been times when we go out and none of the outfalls are discharging, and that's a good/boring day. But typically that doesn't happen in Baltimore. Typically we'll find illicit discharges. So we haven't really had the capacity to go back and rescreen, but that is absolutely something that would be really interesting to map out where you've been and then hit them again, maybe a couple of years later. First of all, because you know that that area is subject to some type of discharge, but also to see if the municipality really did act on your report and if they're really doing what they said they would do.
All right, great. I'm just going to read one more question because we're just about out of time. I'm not sure if this was mentioned. Are there any CSOs in Baltimore?
So in Baltimore, we have that separated system, but we also have a few escape hatches in our sanitary sewer system. So the system was designed with a few structured overflow points so that basically when sewage starts backing up the system, it can be released directly from the sanitary sewer system into the nearest waterway. As part of our federal consent decree that Baltimore City entered into in 2002, all of those overflow points had to be closed off. But then when DPW started closing them off, they realized that sewage backups into people's homes, that problem was being exacerbated like exponentially, which makes sense because if you close a door, the sewage is going to find a window, basically. So it just backs up into people's homes instead of into the stream, which is still a huge problem. So they stopped closing off a couple of key structured overflow points. So to answer the question, we have a separated system, but sometimes it acts like a combined system.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna and Barbara. And thank you to all the attendees. And as a reminder, I'll be sending out the recording of this webinar, the slides, and a few of the other files that Alice said she would share with me. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.